Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Laura Estandia. I'm the Executive Director of Bike Miami Valley, and I'm moderating today's panel. I want to let everybody know that's viewing the presentation that they can drop their questions in the Q&A feature on the right side of your screen. You can upvote those questions for the end of the presentation. To kick us off, I'm going to introduce our panelists for this session. It's not just a bike lane micromobility devices panel. So first up, we have Maggie Pasquillon. Hopefully I said that right. She is the Assistant Law Director for the City of Kettering, Ohio, where she advises the city on a wide range of topics, including city ordinances, legislation, Ohio ethics laws, real estate transactions, public record laws, employment law, constitutional issues, administrative policy, and much more. Prior to her role at the City of Kettering, Maggie served as a talent acquisition specialist for PNC Bank's legal department and as Associate General Counsel for K&D Management, LLC, Northeast Ohio's largest real estate management company. We'll also hear from Michael Schwartz, who is the head of customers and policy at Ride Report. He has more than a decade of experience implementing data-driven transportation plans, policies, and infrastructure. Before starting at Ride Report, Michael worked as a principal transportation planner at San Francisco County Transportation Authority. He works in the public, private, and nonprofit advocacy sectors, which informs his wide-ranging perspective on how to successfully oversee micromobility programs to achieve public policy objectives. At Ride Report, Michael supports public agencies as they contemplate and implement micromobility programs, serving as a consultant on data and policy, while also helping staff effectively leverage Ride Report's software tools. We'll also hear from Amber Wason, who joins Drop Mobility as the Vice President of Operations and Innovation, brought on to manage U.S. operations, drive growth, and fuel innovation. Amber has spent her career bringing emerging transportation technologies to market, launching projects such as the DC Circulator, car sharing at FlexCar, which was acquired by Zipcar, and was early in the e-bike movement as the co-founder of Ride, with two I's, leading consumer e-bike brand. So thank you all for being here. First up, we have Amber speaking, and I'm going to share her slides.
Thank you, Laura, and hi to everyone out there. Appreciate the intro and excited to be here. So I guess I'll just start kind of with a brief background as it relates to my presentation. As Laura mentioned, I just started at Drop Mobility, and at Drop, we white label micromobility systems for cities. So we work with Laura in Dayton, Ohio to supply electric bikes and operate the bike share system there. We as a company are vehicle agnostic, but I come to this presentation with a lens from the e-bike space. I've kind of been in this space now for 7 or 8 years, as my bio said, as Laura presented. Started a company about 8 years ago, Ride, building consumer electric bikes. So I very much come to this presentation with that lens, but wanted to give the background about Drop kind of being this vehicle agnostic platform that currently is 100% electric bike share in the US. So just kind of speaking to market trends and demand, and I'll get more into that as the slides go forward. Laura, you can click to the next one. But just kind of to kick off, wanted to tell a bit about my story. I discovered e-bikes in about 2013 and was a commuter at the time. I live in Washington, D.C. at the top of a really big hill. And so bike commuting always had an asterisk for me. It was either I had to really have a lot of effort and wear clothes that I could get sweaty in. To get back home, it was a really, really steep hill, or I had to make other arrangements, like bike one way to work and then take a bus home or get a ride. So I kind of, the first time I heard about e-bikes, like this light bulb immediately went off. It was solving a huge issue for me. E-bikes at the time in the US were very niche. It was mostly marketed toward baby boomers who, maybe wanted to be able to get out and bike with more intensity than they were used to. And I really kind of, from my background as working in urban transportation, really saw e-bikes as this massive opportunity to kind of transform biking within cities. And it was really exciting for me. So I went and tried some e-bikes at a bike shop. I had never heard of them, and most of the people I spoke with hadn't, but lo and behold, there were that carried them. And what I found when I was kind of looking as a consumer was that a lot of the designs on the market at the time were really clunky and expensive and had no warranties or any type of maintenance along with them. And it was just kind of a scary product to purchase for me, not knowing much about electric transportation. The idea of spending like $3,000 on this really ugly bike was not that appealing to me. And so being kind of entrepreneurial and excited about this technology, my co-founder and I decided to start a company designing our own electric bike that was sleeker and maybe more affordable. So I'll kind of fast forward through the adventures of starting a startup, but designed and shipped 2 versions of the Ride electric bike, and really have had a front row seat to this movement over the past. Our first production run was in 2015. This graph on my slide kind of shows the uptick in electric bikes. These are by imports. Of course, in hardware, growth is often kind of bottlenecked by how many units can be produced and imported. But even 2016 and 2020, like almost doubling the number of imports of e-bikes into the US. And I think that's a trend you'll continue to see. Laura, you can go to the next slide. So clearly I'm bullish on e-bikes. Clearly e-bikes are a trend in the US, and just wanted to touch a bit on why I'm so excited about them, and I think why they are taking off as both shared systems and kind of individual owned product category across the country and the world. The first is just the accessibility. I think there's obvious to this statement. Clearly people with different abilities are able to get on a bike that maybe normally wouldn't be able to. I think when I tell my story about living at the top of a big hill, it really just being able to like wear jeans or a pair of slacks to a meeting when I was bike commuting and not have to pack a backpack with a change of clothes. This just made the form factor that much more approachable. And I think that's kind of being, that's a trend that's catching on across multiple markets. In terms of being used for transportation versus recreation, data is showing time and time again that people are taking more trips on e-bikes. They're taking longer trips that are longer distance, and they're reporting that they're using the bike primarily for transportation as opposed to recreation. And so I think it's a pretty cool, set of data and kind of proof behind this idea that cities are investing in e-bikes, but it's not in vain. Like they're taking cars off the road, they're replacing trips. And that kind of spills into the equity piece. E-bikes, because they are a form of transportation and not just like this, nice to have a bike share system in a beach town or something where only people are using it for recreation and for fun. People are actually using e-bikes to earn an income and access jobs. And I think when you look at cities and municipalities, there are often holes in transportation where people kind of fall through the cracks. Maybe their neighborhood isn't super accessible by transit. Maybe, it's just far, like to use transit, you have to take a bus and transfer. And it's really a big handicap for people who are trying to access good job opportunities. And then finally, there's kind of the obvious health benefits. I think when e-bikes first came out, the first couple of years in this space, defending e-bikes, people would say, oh, they're for lazy people. Oh, why can't you just pedal? But I think the accessibility and kind of the other touch points or talking points I've touched upon today kind of illustrate how it's much more than that. And I think also the data is showing over and over again that any form of active transportation, even if it's assisted with an electric motor, is making people more active. It's good for physical and mental health. And there's just a myriad of benefits beyond just the individual, like in cities, helping with air quality, saving pounds of CO2 and emissions. And so I think that there's a lot of positive from both the micro and the macro perspective. And kind of speaking on the recent rise in demand, so COVID-19 obviously changed the world in so many ways. There has been this big dialogue around micromobility and COVID-19, and it's been really interesting. And I think we'll hear from some other panelists later in this presentation about kind of some macro trends here. But what I find super interesting about kind of this black swan effect of COVID-19 in the micromobility space is that, e-bikes and micromobility were already on the rise. And I think that personally, this has been more of a narrative and a headline than an actual spike in demand. But whatever kind of the trend is and whether it would have existed with or without COVID, I think the idea that people are excited about bikes and they're talking about bikes and there are headlines. Like I remember one from about a year ago that was like, e-bikes are the new toilet paper. Like they weren't in stock anywhere. I think all of those narratives are really positive for the space in general. I think there's some more probably less sexy things to talk about, but other reasons why they're increasing in popularity. The tech is getting a lot better. So those clunky, ugly bikes that I couldn't bring myself to buy 7 years ago don't really exist anymore. There's really beautiful technology. Battery technology is getting better. Bikes are getting more powerful and the prices are coming down. And I think there's kind of this whole movement in the shared space where it's really lowering the barriers for people to try. So again, in the beginning of my experience with e-bikes, I was just getting people to experience them for the first time. And there were all these light bulbs going off the same way it went off for me. But now it's even easier, people can go to Dayton and check out an e-bike and ride around, and it's just exposing more markets to it, which is great. And so to sum up, I just wanted to say, and this is my personal opinion, but I think e-bikes and different forms of electric are here to stay. I think that what you can expect to see in the future is even more form factors. I pictured a cargo bike there with kids. This is a space I'm personally really bullish on. I think it's a really exciting space for delivery, for cargo, for multiple passengers. And, the point I kind of wanted to make on this slide is just that cities and municipalities need to be ready for this, because there's going to be innovation and there's going to be new form factors that fit into different categories or maybe don't fit into categories. And so this is something that we should just all kind of have our eyes on the horizon. And again, I think some of the other panelists today will touch upon what that means from a regulatory and a macro perspective.
Thank you so much. Really nice to be here with everyone. Thanks, Amber, for that great presentation. I feel like the boom in e-bikes is one of the silver linings to the crazy year we had last year, and I'm excited to see adoption taking off so much. As Laura mentioned in her intro for me, I am the head of customers and policy for RideReport. For those of you who don't know about RideReport, we are a software company that helps cities gain insights into their programs. So how to manage day-to-day micromobility programs, which is sort of shared scooters and shared bikes and e-bikes. And also thinking about things like how to evaluate what kinds of policies and also fee and revenue collections. So I'm going to be I'm sort of jumping off of Amber's presentation to touch more on this shared space. One of the great trends I actually realized I should have put back in here is that this space is bringing bikes and really e-bikes back into shared micromobility. For a number of years, a lot of the buzz was around scooters and still is to a certain extent. And I think a lot of the operators have found those to be more profitable. But we have seen in a lot of the markets that we work in 70 cities around the world, that e-bikes are becoming part of the mix. And in some ways, that's actually part of the program. Cities are saying, well, if you want to do scooters, we want to see bikes as well. And so seeing that really nice mix, e-bikes in particular. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk through what I'm calling the 3 phases of shared micromobility. And I have a huge asterisk on this for someone like Laura, who runs a bike share program already. I'm going to call this phase 1, the launch of privately owned and operated dockless bikes and scooters. So we know bike share has existed, and micromobility, I'll just call bike riding, has existed for like 100 years. So I don't want to pretend that everything began with this moment in 2017, or really sort of the launch of dockless bike share in China, which came sort of around the world and then became scooters in 2018. But I'm going to define it this way just because it kind of catches us up to sort of where we are today in terms of options and what's going on in terms of shared micromobility. So phase 1 was really defined as disruption and reactivity. So people turned around one day and all of a sudden they just saw bikes or scooters on their street where they hadn't expected to see them before. And there was a lot of love and the opposite of love, I guess, with respect to this phenomenon. And so it just made a lot of quite a big splash. Next slide. There was a lot of concerns around what people, sort of the clutter that was created on sidewalks. Many people have maybe heard of some of these sites that have popularized where a lot of the equipment is getting thrown away, and they had very short lives. The original set of equipment was not meant to last quite as long. And so there was a lot of sort of concern about, well, how sustainable is this? And cities were basically reacting. They didn't, in many cases, they didn't even have a vehicle type to fit scooters in sort of regulation and law. So there's still some countries actually out there, Australia, the United Kingdom, who don't have a way to legally allow scooters to be on their streets. So this was really like just kind of a surprise. A lot of people compared it to transportation network companies, Uber and Lyft, when they first arrived, and how cities and states and regulatory bodies really needed to react to them. Next slide, please. And so cities did respond, and they came back with a lot of different types of regulations, from outright bans to putting very strict sets of hours or locations where they can operate. They would often include very challenging rules to say about how many could be in certain areas at certain times. And this had varying levels of success. It definitely helped assert that the cities were in charge of the right-of-way, and that these companies could not just put vehicles out on the right-of-way. And at the same time, it also made it challenging for the rules. It was often very challenging to even understand if the rules were being complied with from a city perspective. And that's actually where a company like Ride Report comes in. There's been a lot of really interesting data sharing that has allowed some of that to take place. So next slide, please. And so it really broke into these sort of 3 different constituencies for this phenomenon. The first is really cities and public agencies. And their main reaction was they were really concerned, again, about the legality, and then also whether these were safe was a big question, not just for the scooter riders, but also for people who weren't riding the scooters, like namely people walking on sidewalks. Operators themselves couldn't understand why cities might not want to just embrace this new model and let them scale as big as they wanted. And so they would say all these new rules, it just shows cities don't understand their business and don't listen. Citizens themselves, which is basically, as I said, sort of 2 extremes. Either, can you stop fighting and just let me ride my scooter? Or the alternative, which is, can you just get these scooters out of here? Aren't we done with this already? So there's really just like a lot of kind of politics and different camps. And so what we found to be important, next slide, was to take a big step back and recognize that it's actually really important for a lot of our aligned goals to have micromobility succeed. That there really is a lot of shared interest. Most notably here is talking about sort of congestion and sustainability and climate change, global warming, a lot of things that are near and dear to people's hearts who are attending this conference. So that means there really does need to be a way to have this exist, have it scale up to a certain level to where it can be a reliable part of the transportation, and also not cause a lot of the challenges that I think people have a negative reaction to, things like scooter clutter and potential for safety issues. So, and I think just to sort of rewind the clock on before phase one, it's important to remember that a lot of cities before this phenomenon happened would write very large grants and put a lot of public dollars towards public bike share systems. So it is a known thing that regions are excited about. They know it's an important part of their system. Whether this operational model works or not, I think that's been a big question mark, but it looks like, as I'll get to later in the presentation, it is here to stay. So how do we shape it in such a way that it can succeed for all those parties that I just mentioned? Next slide, please. So micromobility phase two, I'm going to just define as COVID. And there was just a big question in general of, will this industry even survive? Particularly in the early days of COVID, there was one of the sort of hallmarks of the first phase was that there was a lot of venture capital money and private investment in these companies. That had started to slow down even before COVID. And there was sort of a lot of consolidation, a lot of operators going out of business, which is another challenge of this model. If you're a kind of city or region that's really relying on a company, if you don't own the equipment yourself and a company goes out of business, then you're left without an operator. So next slide, please. And so we saw, this is just February versus April. This slide is actually a little bit dated because this is now over a year old, but like pretty much all travel, not just micromobility, things kind of went off a cliff. So trips, vehicles for rent, trips per vehicle per day, we're down almost 100%, the 90+% really across the board of all the markets that we were following. So basically, as everybody froze, so did micromobility. Next slide, please. It did start to come back as things reopened a little bit in different markets. And one of the things we saw was a change in the profile of trips. So before COVID, we saw a lot of short trips. And you can see that that tended to be, this is really with respect to scooters, that they tend to be somewhere between half a mile and a mile and a half tended to be most of your trips, which is consistent with kind of what you would imagine someone might take a scooter for. After COVID-19, it still had a relatively similar profile, but you can see that huge bump in those 5+ mile trips. And so I think people really started to use the shared micromobility as a way to take more recreational, longer trips that aren't necessarily just about getting to a destination, but a way to be outside, enjoy the fresh air, do something fun, particularly after the lockdown. And this profile is especially pronounced with e-bikes, because as Amber noted, it's easier to go farther even with an e-bike. Next slide, please. We did see some adaptation and experimentation from operators. So some operators made themselves useful during particularly lockdowns to have programs to provide rides for essential workers to be able to get to and from their shifts, which really was something that was heavily utilized in certain cities when those were really the only people who were allowed to be out. Others shifted to some of the models that Amber talked about, like delivery, so that all of a sudden scooters and things could be used for delivering food to people or other essential items, which became very important during the pandemic. Next slide. Also in 2020, public agencies adapted to. We saw more experimentation with how to use streets in 2020 than I think I have seen in my entire career. It was really quite incredible how very quickly people were willing to say, let's see if we can use these streets for something else. We have really different needs than we had before. And so these ideas of slow streets where you would close streets to through traffic, allow more ways for people to get out and be spaced and enjoy their streets was really interesting. Over in the middle there, that's actually the UK, where as part of trialing e-scooters, where as I mentioned, they're not even fully legal yet, they're also talking about building huge amounts of infrastructure as a place for them to be able to ride. And I know that's the theme of our talk today is how do you sort of think of the streets as more than just car lane, bike lane, but really what are the various users of our streets, including micromobility. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to talk about where I think we are now, which is phase 3. We've gone from that sort of disruption and reactivity, the sort of let's see what's going to happen. And now we're really in this phase of partnership where I do think that cities are starting to understand, and all the different constituencies are understanding, hey, there's something here. How do we really make this work in a way that is sustainable? Next slide. So we are still in this wait and see moment for how transportation patterns shake out. This is Apple's tracking of people's transportation from the beginning of the pandemic to now. You can see that driving, well, actually, I'm sorry, that's walking is still way up, and driving is way up even since the beginning of the pandemic. It's above baseline. So people really are getting back in their cars. They're moving around. People are walking more. That's actually not surprising given COVID. Transit, however, is still continuing to struggle, and that's an ongoing phenomenon, something that we hope will be supported with federal funds to help ensure that those transit agencies survive. And maybe as people get vaccinated and get more comfortable being in transit, that will come back even more. But it does mean that there's sort of this in-between moment here of maybe there's something else that needs to be provided rather than a traditional bus or train, something where micromobility might slot in really nicely. Next slide, please. And so we are also seeing micromobility trips rising again. So this is our own internal data. This is for a couple of example markets. You can see how far down it is in May of last year. And now you can see that it's really starting to go up again. And from what we're seeing is numbers are starting to reflect pre-pandemic levels for micromobility, that this year, as people are really starting to get vaccinated, starting to get out and about more, people are using shared micromobility as they were before the pandemic. Next slide. So one of the ways that I really see this partnership showing up is with respect to fees and subsidies. So when shared micromobility first launched, a lot of cities, as a way to make the program sustainable, would charge fairly sizable upfront fees for people to be able to operate in their cities. So they would charge either just a straight permit fee or a per vehicle fee. We started to see things like per trip fees, which is a more sustainable way to grow, with the idea being that when the operators are making money, then the cities are making money. But there's a little bit of experimentation. And now really seeing a lot of different ideas around this. A couple of examples here. Denver, Colorado is about to relaunch its program with only 2 operators, and it's a very lucrative market. Lots of scooter and e-bike ridership in that area, and to give it to only 2 operators is a really big deal. And so rather than have them pay permit fees, they're actually saying, we want you to supply us with a certain amount of public good. So that includes free trips for low-income residents, and underserved areas, actually in a very significant way. I think it's like 5,000 passes that they're giving out for people to have access to free trips. And then in addition, distribution of vehicles across the city. So making sure that they are being serviced in certain areas where they know there's either less transportation or it's traditionally been underserved by all types of different transportation. So it's just a way to say, we're going to quantify that there is this public benefit. We know this costs the operators money. And to offset it, we're giving you near exclusive access, or just two operators in a very lucrative market. So that's just a way to think about partnership. Sacramento, California also has a really interesting model. And we're actually going to be having a webinar featuring Sacramento in a couple weeks, just to sort of plug that, where they're going to talk about, they had a shared bike program, and they crunched a bunch of numbers, and they basically decided, yes, we could apply for those grants kind of in the before dockless era, and buy the equipment and then pay someone to operate it. But actually what's easier is to allow a company, they're allowing Lime to come in and do their e-bike bike share. And what they're saying is Lime has to supply a certain minimum number. If the bikes are not very well used and therefore the company's not making money, they will actually subsidize each of those vehicles on a daily basis. So it's a certain, I forget what the exact number is, but they say, hey, we'll give you this much to keep the bikes out there every day. And then it becomes a sliding scale. As the bikes get used more and more, the subsidy goes down lower and lower. And then once it reaches a certain threshold, they actually start charging per trip fees to the operator. So basically the idea is, we recognize this is a public service to be able to have these bikes. And if it's not profitable, we want to pay in public dollars to make sure that it's there. But if it becomes very profitable, we basically want to join in the profit sharing to say that we get some of that money back. really interesting model, and excited to see how that works out. And then finally, in Austin, Texas, that's more of a straight per trip fee. And they are also, again, a very large market, and particularly before the pandemic, with their huge events that they have. Scooters and bikes are a really good way to get around during those. And so they are charging operators those per trip fees as a way to say, hey, we're partners in this with you. If you do well, then we do well. And we can hopefully put that right back into infrastructure to give you more ability to have safe places to ride. Next slide, please. And so where those fees go, as I was alluding to, is around safety and infrastructure. This is an exciting thing about micromobility, is that there's really become an interesting way to share this really rich data set, where you can really track on an aggregate scale where people are riding, where are the sort of popular destinations, what kinds of streets do they ride on. We are actually going to be launching a public dashboard in the next couple of weeks, where people will be able to look at the chart like you see on your upper right part of your screen, that looks at where people are riding in comparison to things like bike lanes and even the high injury network as part of City's Vision Zero efforts. And so that's going to be really exciting for people to have access to that. And then on the lower left, that's actually looking at where people are ending their trips. Those are sort of heat map cluster analyses to show where things like parking corrals would be most effective. Those purple circles are actually L stations in Chicago. This is sample data. It's not real data, but you can basically see, oh, well, if I were to put in a parking corral, it should probably be on this side of the street and closer to this intersection. This is where people are naturally tending to leave their vehicles. So this is really exciting for cities and soon the general public to have access to this data, advocacy groups too, to really start thinking about, hey, how much are these getting used? Where are they getting used? What kinds of trips are these vehicles using? And I should note that this picture on the bottom right is actually in Paris, France, where they have over 30,000 scooters as part of their program. It's just an enormous program. And they did have a lot of sidewalk clutter where people were leaving their scooters everywhere. And what they did is they put in places to leave their vehicles on a massive scale. Literally almost every block has either a physical corral or something painted like what you see in the picture. And almost overnight, it completely cleaned up the sidewalk clutter, because people really were looking for a place to leave their vehicles. And once they had that place and they didn't have to walk 3 extra blocks to do it, because we all know that bike and scooter riders are not going to do that, people put them in that place. And so it's really starting to think about, again, that partnership of, hey, it's worth having this infrastructure because there is this public good. And by the way, operators, we might charge you a fee to help cover the cost of implementing that, but then it benefits you in return by having a space for you to leave your vehicles. Next slide, please. And then this is just another reminder here that when that money goes in, supporting both bike racks and protected lanes, it really helps to support safer streets for all road users, not just scooter riders, but bike riders. Clarification of the lanes can really help with public transportation. And this tweet on the right, it just came out. I would love to see the actual numbers, but Lime put out just a couple days ago that in cities where they have data, they saw a huge increase in use of new lanes. So wherever there was new infrastructure, there was a whole lot of use of that. And that's not very surprising. But again, it goes to show that sort of virtuous cycle of you collect fees, build better infrastructure, more people use it of all varieties, helps you generate more fees to put in more infrastructure. Next slide, please. Oh, that is it. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the chance to present and looking forward to the Q&A.
Hi, everybody. I am Maggie Pasquillon. I'm Assistant Law Director with the City of Kettering. I just want to thank Michael and Amber. Those were really informative. I was taking notes the whole time. And I just want to start. I want to say I am actually not any sort of shared mobility device expert. I am more of one of those people who knows maybe a little bit about a lot of subjects because I am we've kind of funneled down into the local level here. And so I am, like I said, Assistant Law Director with the City of Kettering. And one of the many hats that I wear and jobs that I do is working with city staff and city council on regulations, on city ordinances. So those topics can range from animals in the city to, medical marijuana to shared mobility devices. It's a huge wide range of topics. So I am still learning along with a lot of you about this topic. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today is, kind of the schoolhouse rock. How does a bill become a law on the local level in regard to shared mobility devices in these programs and companies? So I'll go to my first slide, Laura, if you don't mind. This is kind of tiny there, and I apologize for that. I needed to fit a lot on there. I just wanted to talk about first, and Michael hit on a lot of these points really well, but how did micromobility device and these sharing programs come to our attention on the local level? And really it's word of mouth. It can come in these topics can come to our attention in a lot of different ways. It can come from constituents and citizens, or it can come from schools or neighboring cities and towns. It can come from the news. There can be so many different ways these topics come to us. But in particular, I think this one came to us mostly because the city of Dayton, which is really, a couple minutes away from us, has this incredible program. And that kind of started to spread. The word kind of started to spread a little bit. And there's a little tiny suburb between the city of Dayton and Kettering, which is Oakwood. And they kicked it off they heard about it and they saw, on their border, some scooters and things being left in yards and different things. And so they instituted a moratorium. And I call our moratorium just a moment to pause. We did institute a moratorium on mobility device programs for about a year. And the purpose behind that typically is, and especially for Kettering, I find, is not to, with the intention of banning anything, but to find more about that particular topic if it's something we don't know very much about yet. So we took a year. I worked with Andy Eit, who is on this call as well in our engineering department. And we had some conversations with Laura, and we had conversations with other cities who have programs. And just wanted to know, how's it going? How's it working for you guys? Is this something that's really going to fit? So we took our moratorium as more of a moment to do our research. And when we say fit in Kettering, we really mean, based on our geography, based on our business districts, based on the different kinds of folks we have in Kettering, who will ride those things? Who's going to ride them? Is our population older? Is it really a group of people that honestly is going to be interested in something like this? Or is it something that maybe students and by our schools would be more interested in? Is it something that our business districts are set up for? That kind of thing. We do have trails. We thought we have a lot of interest in closing last mile gaps on our city council. There's several individuals who, if not all of them, I'd say, are very interested in closing last mile gaps, because we do have some gaps in our bus line and different transportation routes. So we knew that would be an interest for certain people. So we did some research on all the different benefits, and there's so many. We found, it encourages physical activity. There's definitely less traffic. It's all things Amber mentioned at first. It's a fun and interesting way to travel and explore the city. And we have lots of parks and lots of different things that we want, could connect people to. It can reduce parking issues, and again, closing last mile gaps. So we thought those are really great benefits. We also took a look at all the risks, because we knew those would be big questions. So we looked at those safety issues. We looked at those aesthetic issues that Michael pointed out, where you've got things kind of piled up and people don't know where to put them. And maybe someone is whizzing by as someone's coming out of a business door, and, whatever that might be. And also community relation issues. Are our businesses and our business districts, do they want something like this? Is this something that is seen as good for them, or is this something that is a hindrance or a burden, or what kind of complaints are we going to get? I'd say Kettering in general is more of a spread out suburb. So we're not a big city. Where I'd say we're a bigger suburb. And we're also not a college town either. We're near some of those things, but we're not the typical customer for the shared mobility device programs. And we kind of wondered, is anyone really going to be interested in coming here anyway? But we knew that this was such a growing trend that we wanted to have an infrastructure or regulations in place to make sure that if someone did come and was interested in going in our right of way, that we were ready. And so Andy and I put together a presentation with all of our research, and this is typically how a lot of cities work. You put together your research into a presentation, and you also make a recommendation. There you give options to your city council. You present that to them so that they can kind of weigh the risks and benefits. One big question they always have is, what are other cities doing? What are the surrounding cities doing? And don't quote me on this because this is older data and I haven't gone back to update this since my presentation, but I was able to tell them that Dayton, Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Athens, Ohio all allowed shared mobility device programs and had good programs going and regulated those, but they were up and running. They were banned eventually in our neighboring little town called Oakwood. And then in Centerville, Beaver Creek, Springboro, Westchester, Westerville, Strongsville, and Yellow Springs, which are all kind of around this greater area, at that time either had like a moratorium or just didn't have anything yet. And granted, this is all coming right in the middle of COVID. So some other priorities are probably taking place, and it's not to say that they weren't talking about it or thinking about it or aren't currently. So next slide there, Laura. So after we do our research and we get our presentation together, Andy and I went to City Council and we were able to talk to them about the risks, the benefits, the technology itself, and then make our recommendations. So we did recommend allowing shared mobility devices to plant roots down in the city, but with regulations. And something that was really important to us and that Laura helped us figure out was that we don't want to over-regulate to the point where we're basically saying, don't come here. So that was important to us. And currently we are in, when we did the presentation, City Council did agree with us that that was a good idea. We want to be inviting to these companies, but we do want some regulations so that we are getting the benefits, reaping all these great benefits potentially, but also minimizing the risks, because there are risks, just like with everything. So that was the direction for us, and that is where we are currently. We are in the middle of, or I am in the middle of, drafting those regulations. And so once our regulations are drafted, we will go back to City Council. They will get to read, they will get to ask questions and comment and do all that. We'll have public commentary. We do 2 readings of the ordinance and at 2 separate meetings so that there's plenty of time to think about this and get it right. And then at the second reading, City Council will vote on whether or not that will become an ordinance. Now, if they decide that, yes, we're good, we're going to vote yes, then that's when we go back and we publish the ordinance. And that's basically when all the back end starts happening. So staff starts drafting all the documents they would need, say for permits or fee structure or whatever those might be. But staff starts getting busy on the back end. They can also vote no, and no can mean we're done. We're just not going to have any ordinance at all. No can also mean go back to the drawing board and start over based on what we hear from the public, based on what we hear and the questions we have from City Council. But typically, we've kind of read the room enough up until that point. We spent enough time on it that we feel like we have a good fit by the time we get there to that stage. All right, next slide. We kind of went through those first 2 bullets already. But I will kind of touch on those regulations themselves, and how Andy and I presented this to City Council was Athens, Ohio is a college town who they do have a program, a shared mobility device program there now. And I worked with some of them and I looked at their regulations, and it did appear to be an ordinance that was not too bulky, too complicated. We weren't putting time limits on when people could ride these. We weren't doing any of that. But what we did like was they did have a limit on how many of these could be in the city, how many devices could be in the city total. So we liked that idea. That would cut down on, the aesthetic issue of just having, lots of these piled up places and all of that. We liked the fact that they had a designated parking places. That was important. They had last mile gap regulations in there where they talked about working with these companies on, a certain portion or percentage of the devices were going to be placed in areas where there's an underserved community, right? And we really liked how they wrote that and how they did that. So that was important. And then they also had a section about data collection, and that's why Michael's job is interesting to me. I thought it was really interesting that the city was able to work with these companies and gain access to who's riding the bikes, not necessarily by name or anything like that. We just want to know like a general data regarding what kinds of demographics were riding the bikes and where they were going, what areas were working, what areas aren't. If we want to close last mile gaps, we really want to know if anyone's using them. Where are the places where they can work the best and really fit and survive and do well and succeed. So that was interesting to us. Also being able to permit these companies and make sure we're working together and keeping track of what's going on. That was important as well. So that data collection was something that we intend to have in our regulations as well, and so that we can analyze the program at the end of the year after 6 months or whatever it might be. But I also want to talk about that we're very aware that right now we're probably not the customer that a lot of these companies are interested in, but we thought that at some point they might be. It's spreading like wildfire, and it's something that at some point maybe one of these companies would want to check out Kettering. So that's where we are, and still in the middle of writing those regulations.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you all. Some great presentations. We do have some questions in the chat, but I wanted to kick off with a question from our kind of panel prep session. We talked a lot about the local level, and people might be thinking about these types of devices for their specific community, but we also know people don't just travel within their jurisdiction alone. So where have you seen some examples of regional networks and places that are either collaborating on regulations, the types of providers they have, and how that's been working kind of across the country? Amber or Michael, you want to start maybe with that one?
Yeah, I can chime in. Just living in Washington, D.C., we kind of span a few different jurisdictions, as you know, both on the city side, but also state side. So we're across Maryland, Virginia, and then the District of Columbia. I'm not a regulatory expert, but I have kind of seen it as a consumer. And I know that, from the beginning, it's just been really important that there are cohesive discussions that are regional. In the DC area, we have, regional entities, whether it's WMATA or the Washington Council of Governments, that addresses these issues regionally. And so there are systems of government that are kind of in place to deal with these types of issues. probably Michael or Maggie can speak more intelligently about like the regulatory side of things.
Yeah, I'll just chime in here briefly. I think it touches on one of the questions we've gotten to about smaller cities as part of a larger metro region. We have seen some better coordination, not everywhere, but in some places where either regional governments, as Amber was referring to, like a council of governments, or the MPO, which is the regional transportation body, really getting into some sort of coordination role. So in Denver, where we work, the Denver Regional Council of Governments has done a data contract. And so actually our contract is with them, but then every jurisdiction that launches a program in that region gets access to our tools. And so something as simple as quantifying your metrics, how many trips, how many vehicles, it's all consistent so that they can actually get a true regional picture. And I think that's a really great first step towards what's a really broader issue. As Laura mentioned, I worked in the Bay Area for 10 years, and there's 27 different transit agencies, and you pay a different fare on each one, which is crazy. And so when they brought the bike share program, it was really important to get something regional when it came in. And my understanding, I don't know Miami Valley super well, but there is this sort of regional trail network, and there is a lot of that connectivity. And I think taking a regional approach makes a lot of sense. And you let some of the maybe more productive or lucrative markets help sort of offset or subsidize some of the places where, they may not be some of the primo markets. But if they only have to set up one warehouse, but they can serve a whole region, there are some economies of scale for the operators. So speaking with a regional voice can actually get you even more, along with things like fee programs. And I think what Amber was pointing to also with WMATA, transit agencies, I actually don't know Miami Valley, but maybe there is a regional transit agency. And if there is, that sometimes that's a really good body, because these are really, in some ways, a form of public transportation. It's connecting you to and from stations, or when you arrive somewhere, how do I get to the next place? And if you think about it from that perspective, that's a way to maybe bring it into that regional conversation and think about it in that context.
I would agree with that, and I think that is something that once some of the other suburbs and surrounding areas kind of get on board, that I've seen that in other areas of regulation in Kettering, with small cell or with internet or whatever it might be. Where we work together to, have come to some sort of understanding where we share costs on things and that sort of thing. So that's definitely an option that could be down the pike.
Just to add one more thing to this, also is just to think about federal funding sources. Hopefully everybody is watching the Biden administration as they are trying to push through some large infrastructure bill that I think is likely to include eligibility for things like potentially bike share programs. And if you become part of sort of a public transportation system, that may make you eligible for different types of dollars than you would be if you're just thinking about it as sort of like, oh, this is a bike type program. It's just open funding sources that could be really useful to help subsidize.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Watching the Biden administration, there's a lot of sexy talk happening right now. Hopefully it all comes through. But for active transportation advocates, it's like, wow, we can't wait. Will there also be trains? Maybe. All right. So another question in the chat. What are the most important actions that local municipalities and their community partners can take to prepare for the evolution and growth of shared micromobility networks?
Take that one. Or Michael, you take it. You go ahead.
Yeah, I'll maybe go policy or high level approach. I'm sure Maggie has more specifics, but to me, one of the things that's most important is to define what your goals are for such a program. So in that phase one reactivity, I think that a lot of cities got caught up in, well, the only thing I want to do is make sure I don't get complaints, right? Like that, and hopefully these things get ridden a little bit. And those were like the only two goals that they had for the program. But if you can start to define things like, hey, we want to reduce VMT. So how do we measure if these reduce VMT? Or we want to support equity. I saw that in the Q&A as well. How do we make sure that these vehicles are distributed to underserved areas? And really starting to define that. Once you have that defined, then there are actually some really interesting ways to measure it. But I think that just starting with, hey, if we start a program, what are we even trying to achieve? How will we measure if it's successful or if we need to adjust to make it successful?
Get to this question to Maggie. Chris wanted to know how important is fee generation to Kettering and to all? What fee models, like what Michael outlined, would work best for both cities and operators?
Yeah, I think for us, the fees really aren't about profit generation. It's really about covering costs. So we are, when we're looking at things like trying to close last mile gaps, our goal is not to make money off this. It's really just make sure we're not losing money in terms of staff time, in terms of, hey, are we going to be the ones painting parking? What resources and things are we spending? We want to kind of try to make that up with a permit fee. I think right now we're looking at permit fees only because we are not, I don't think we'll be at a scale that some of these larger cities are where they're doing the sliding scale and that kind of thing. But we're certainly happy to look at that. Look at that, honestly. I think we're in the early stages of that, but fee generation, I really just think we're looking to cover costs. And that's typically what we do for most things when we're talking about planning and development type stuff. So.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that there's a wide range and there has been a lot of experimentation. And one of the tensions is really around cities need to have upfront knowing what their revenues are going to be, so they can say, hey, well, we know we're going to spend this amount of time. How do we make sure, versus if you do a per trip fee, you won't actually know until the program's implemented and the funds are going to trickle in over time. So we've started to see a little bit of this idea of, well, hey, what if the operators pay you up front and then they can draw down that account on a per trip fee basis, just to say like, hey, how do we, have something that seems fair, but doesn't necessarily make it unsustainable so that the operators can't continue. And then I think to Maggie's point, I think, cost recovery is generally the approach. It's just sort of what you define as your program. Does it include things like parking corrals and things like that, or is it just staff time, et cetera, et cetera? So defining that is also very important. And I think, the final piece, again, thinking about if you think of this as a public service or like public transportation, is only fee collection or is also some sort of subsidy appropriate, and the ability to get grants to help have this be sustainable, assuming it's something that you actually want for your community.
Thank you all. Thank you, Amber, Maggie, and Michael, for sharing your knowledge with us.